it depends on who the person is that experienced that trauma in their past. I mean, that's why it was so interesting to me to understand that Catherine, Lucy's mother-in-law, had also come from very, very deprived beginnings, and yet she seemed to have traveled through society at a much faster pace than Lucy seems to have managed. So I think it depends on who the person is, but certainly to some extent our past does shape us. Well, it's interesting because I never write a novel from beginning to end, and I never have. And so I do work in scenes, and then when I have scenes that I think what I call have a heartbeat to them, they stay on the table and the other ones get tossed onto the floor. And so when I have these scenes, I realize that in some way they will connect with each other. And so that's really that's almost the start of the process of making the book, which is to find the beginning and then which scene, connects to another scene and which one connects to the other. So that's really how I go about making the book.
I started writing this quite a while, 2014, 2015. Perhaps if I started writing it now, I would pause a bit, because now there is that question of permission. Are you allowed to write from the point of view of a closeted gay man if you're a cisgender, hetero, normative male? But at the time I did it not as a political statement, because I don't think I wouldn't claim it's a LGBTQ novel, or even the fact that he's a gay character is much of a thematic thing. It's more of a plot thing. But I think it came from, I did model it on Richard de Soysa. I did model Maali on Richard de Soysa. And though Richard de Soysa was an activist and a thespian, and this guy turned out to be a war photographer and a gambler, but the fact that they were both closeted gay men in the late 80s, that was something that stayed with each revision. And I think it just made sense to me that would explain some of the reason for some of his decisions to go into these situations, into these dangerous parts of the country, because perhaps he felt he couldn't be himself in Colombo, that he had to go out station where no one knew him in order to express himself sexually, as well as professionally to take the photographs. So it just seemed to make sense. And I think when I write in the first person or the second person, you always need a detail so that you're not basically making them a mouthpiece for your emotions and thoughts. And here, the fact that he was a closeted gay man, it made me use my imagination and inhabit another life. And I think, it wasn't something I thought too deeply of, but I tried to be honest to his relationships and to how he viewed himself sexually. So I bought a bunch of show and tell. So obviously the first one, Uncle Kurt, who, I've written about why he was such an influence, but, and this lady here, Margaret Atwood, William Goldman, and Stephen King, when I was researching horror. These are the guys who I want to read everything they've ever done. And I think mainly because they're all like big ideas writers, but their books are quite readable, even though they're full of these big concepts. And I think that's the thing I aspire to. But with this book specifically, the things I read were Cloud Atlas, read that many times, watched the film. I know some people say it's confusing, but those people are wrong. And this one, Lincoln in the Bardo, which won the Booker Prize, and while I was writing this, I thought, is there room for another talking ghost book? But I thought, why not? And of course, Sandman for the world building. This is the kindly ones, the one with the most story. But yeah, I just kind of absorbed a lot of all this stuff. So mix of literary and so I guess more traditional fantasy. But I think a lot of these guys are my favorite writers because of, what I said before. They can talk of big ideas in simple language and talk of grim concepts and grim situations with dark gallows humor, and that's something that I've always tried to do.
So it really depends on the writer. Some people go looking for stories. They find them around them. Sometimes they have to travel far. Some people steal stories. Some people have stories happen to them, as was the case with me back in 2017, when I woke up one morning to find that Zimbabwe's long-serving president had been outed by his military. And so the story kind of really fell on my lap without me having to work for it. But what I think made the difference is the fact that I made myself available for the story. I recognized that there was something there I could potentially write about. So I think the thing is to move through the world with all the curiosity and the alertness in case stories come to you or come at you while you're not expecting as well, because that's a perfectly legitimate way of telling a story or finding a story. I'd say my biggest hope is that people, especially from places like Jidata, and unfortunately there are a lot of places like those, read the book, if only to participate in the conversation that actually inspired me to write Glory. And that is the question of how do we get free? How do we live in communities, in countries that accord us the dignity that we deserve?
I'm happy to discover that someone thinks that I found the perfect end sentence. For me, stories always go on. It's just a matter of abandoning them. So that's just where I happen to step out of the frame. Well, that's quite easy. They're members of the KKK. So they are necessarily objects of ridicule. As for their appearing cartoonish and shall we say, stupid, I was only trying to be historically accurate. I certainly wish that I could make a story up as I go along, but I can't do that. So I don't use outlines. I make for myself what might be called a map. I have a general idea of where I'm going. But as anyone who does any exploring knows, a map is merely an excuse to get lost. My destination can change. The places I decide to stop may well change. But I do have a general idea of how I like to proceed. Well, it's certainly not the case that it portrays all of rural Southern or white America, but it certainly is true of some Americans as extant beings. So one need only look at the current hearings about the January 6th riots on the Capitol building in Washington to understand that this sort of regressive, almost antebellum Civil War thinking still exists.
No, I invented him entirely. And no, there are no others. I usually rely on a place I've been to, somewhere I know, in order to set my story, somewhere to set my story. And then I decide on a time. But I love to invent everybody on those pages. So no. But he exists for me now. I mean, I feel I know him now, and he's somebody I live with. But no, he's not based on anybody I've ever met or heard about. I think they just come from the place and seem to belong there, and maybe they somehow appeal to me aesthetically. There's not a lot of light. I mean, physical light in the book. I think there's a lot of light otherwise, but there's not a lot of physical light in the book, and it's a dark, cold, wet winter. And the crows seem to belong there. But I also love crows, and I've read Ted Hughes and his crows, and they're wonderful. And they're so playful and intelligent and watchful and listening. And it felt like that married up aesthetically with the feeling of the place. Without doubt, it's when you're struggling to discover or find what it is you're writing about, and then something works on the level of suggestion which you may not have expected. And what you were struggling with becomes real work, and you've got a decent paragraph, and then you find another decent paragraph to compose another decent paragraph to go alongside of that, and they start talking back to each other. And then you try and write another one, and then you wake up the next day knowing that you have a decent page or something that could be a decent page, and the text becomes promising, and then you're in, and you keep on working. And without doubt, that's the loveliest part of work.
Everything I have ever read is in Treacle Walker, not consciously. And that is what has... I've written 10 novels, and Treacle Walker is the only one where I haven't done a great deal of conscious, academic level research. With Treacle Walker, I just let it come. I've not had the experience of writing a long book, but I think that to try to write a long book in a short time would be a form of jerry-building that would result in the immediate collapse of the book. I don't see how it can be done. In a way, the question's a bit awkward, because the way that I look at a book is that it has its own length and its own time. I don't consciously control that. So the first part of the question makes more sense to me, in that I try to write the book in as simple a way and as efficiently and as briefly as I can, so as not to get the words in between me and the reader. So I've never written a long book.